set the scene by saying that in China there are three drivers or three things happening in the market that underpin everything that's happening and some of the key messages flowing from this morning. First of all, China is undergoing what some analysts refer to as the Great Rebalancing. So China's growth has been fed or fueled by incredible investment in hard infrastructure, road, rail, ports, etc. However, the economy has not had enough growth coming from consumer consumption, people spending money in shops and stores. And the government's policy settings are designed to get that balance between investment and consumption into better balance. Secondly, you've got, Cheryl referred to the emerging middle class, and it's sort of like everyone talks about the middle class in Asia. When you go to China, you'd actually see it, you can feel it. The Shanghai I went to 1 year ago was not the Shanghai I first visited in the late 80s. Totally different. It's a remarkable market, and the fact is that Chinese consumers and the Chinese middle class has a capacity to spend money in stores that many of us who have not been there would find quite remarkable. The third driver of change in China is the shift from the rural centres into the urban centres. So for the first time last year, China's urban population outnumbered its rural population. What that means is that when you have urban centres growing, you start to stimulate the growth of the services sector of your economy. And again, this goes to rebalancing. So just as by way of an aside, the largest Australian employers of Chinese nationals in China are services companies. ANZ Bank, Worley Parsons in oil and gas, and a company called DTZ in property services. So the services sector in China is growing. All of that change, particularly the growth in income and the growth in the middle class, means that you've got an aspirational population in China which is no different to the aspirations of the people gathered in this room. Mums and dads in China want the same things for their kids and their families as we want for ours. They want a better quality of life, they want better housing, they want better food. So we're seeing a shift from plant protein diet to animal protein diet. And hence, in the context of agribusiness and food, that's the relevance of what's happening in China to this market. I think that slide basically nails the point of being here this morning. The black bar on the top slide, on the top against China, shows you the phenomenal anticipated growth in China's demand for agribusiness products. So I won't go into the numbers, we'll touch on those later. You'll see Japan, contrary, I don't want to undermine the good work that Brett's done, but Japan does have a particularly severe demographic challenge lying ahead of it, and that's reflected in the anticipated reduction in demand in the longer term. But China remains an incredible growth story for Australian companies. So I've talked about changing diet. Food, beef. I'll just go to beef to start with. Last year, our beef exports, albeit coming off a very low base, increased by 254% in 12 months. In the last 6 months of last year, it was a 500% increase in beef export from Australia to China. Now, we haven't quite nailed the reason for that. We're grateful for it, we applaud it, we celebrate it, but I can't pretend I know why there's been such a remarkable increase in such a short time. Food safety. I commented to Peter, sitting next to me here before, that photograph is probably inappropriate. The photograph that should be there is what? Who reads the newspapers? Pigs. Pigs. Pigs floating down the Huangpu River. Okay, 6,000 dead pig carcasses this week floating down the river. It underlines again a point that I touched on in a presentation yesterday. The Chinese, at the risk of generalising, have had a gutful of the the environmental price that they are paying for their economic success. So the outrage generated by 6,000 pigs floating down the Brisbane River is identical to the outrage being experienced in Shanghai at the moment. Acute sensitivity to food safety. We'll all remember the melamine crisis of 2008 in terms of the melamine in infant milk powder. The demand for infant milk formula, again, is topical in the press at the moment, and it can be traced directly back to the melamine scandal. More recently, Yum brand, which is the largest, runs the KFC chain of stores in China. Their sales have been impacted, I think, between 10 and 20% by some problems associated with the way that chickens are being grown in China. So all of these things are building community outrage and an increased focus on food safety. The loss of arable land, I should touch on that because it goes back to the urban migration story. You've got a double-edged sword there. You've got people leaving the land, so no longer producing the crops they were once raising or the pigs they were raising in their backyards. That's impact one. Impact two, those farmers are moving into new estates that have been built on the land that previously was used for raising crops and pigs, etc. So you've got an erosion of the productive food base, and over time, presumably, China will become more efficient in the way that their agriculture is organised and crops and animals are raised. Let me skip to Hong Kong. This is my third gig in this venue over the years. I've been here in the past talking about Hong Kong. I've been here talking about Japan, and today I'm talking about China. I feel like a rat with a gold tooth, but I'm not. I genuinely believed it when I was talking about Hong Kong, and I was very passionate about my time in Japan. But Hong Kong, I'm sure many of you know Hong Kong, know it well. If you go shopping in Park and Shop in Hong Kong, it's very little different to the experience you would have walking down the aisles in Woolworths and Coles. There are many, many Australian brands in Hong Kong. It's a sophisticated, high income, high disposable income market with a voracious demand for global brands and high-end products. Increasingly, Chinese tourists are swamping the China market in numbers that are becoming uncomfortable for the Hong Kong population, in fact, becoming a source of some friction. Nonetheless, the advantage for us is that those Hong Kong tourists travelling through Hong Kong are exposed to Australian food products. So whether it's the milk and dairy products, whether it's the wine products, that interaction between the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong has a net positive impact for Australian companies. Just on infant formula, just while I touch on it again, everyone familiar with recent press reporting about restrictions placed on infant milk powder in Hong Kong? Okay, so basically there were press reports here in Australia going back 6 to 8 weeks about Chinese students allegedly hoovering up all the milk powder from supermarkets in Sydney and sending them across to China. Same thing is happening in New Zealand, same thing is happening in Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong authorities last week arrested 45 people because they were carrying in excess of their entitled limit of 2 cans of baby milk powder per man per day. Right? It's just indicative of the sensitivity of the Chinese mainland and their demand for non-Chinese produced food for their children and the impact it's having on the global infant formula market. Taiwan. I'm not going to read through that slide, you can all read that for yourselves. Basically, number 6 market for us, which surprises a lot of people. Very small island tucked away off the right-hand side of China, but a very significant market for Australian agribusiness in particular. And increasingly, as the ties between Taiwan and the mainland and transport access becomes more accessible, you've got more and more Chinese tourists flooding into the Taiwanese market. Again, similar to Hong Kong, that exposes Chinese consumers to Australian brands, Australian products, and has a net positive impact. Getting our beef and our wine in particular into 5-star hotels in China is positive, in Taiwan, is a positive thing for Australian business. There's a question mark over the 7% figure. I'm not quite sure how fresh it is because many of China's rivers are actually non-productive. The Huai River up north is that they're so badly polluted. I think I read somewhere the other day, 1,500 paper mills along one river in particular, and the water is effectively dead. So China has a serious problem with the quality of its land, the quality of its water, and whilst not directly relevant here, it was relevant in the context of yesterday's presentation in terms of Australian companies with expertise in water management, irrigation management, etc. Because as China's agribusiness reforms, they need to become more productive and they need to embrace more modern irrigation systems or techniques. That's the China story in a nutshell. $6 billion worth of agribusiness products coming into China from Australia. Now, in the context of Brett's slide mentioned $82 billion worth of exports from Australia to China. Perhaps it's small, but that's because minerals and energy take up around 80% of our exports to China. But $6 billion is very significant, particularly for our wine industry, particularly for our dairy industry, and particularly for our beef industry. The only cautionary note I'll strike on this slide is food safety services. I've said a lot about China's sensitivity to food safety. In a sense, that slide betrays what I would call a degree of wishful thinking. We look at the China market, we read about the pig floating down the river, and we assume, therefore, that China will be prepared to pay for technology and services which improve the quality of their food production. So we've got it up there as an opportunity for Australian business. I'd have to be honest with you and say I'm yet to see it. We believe it should be there, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend that we've got a queue of Chinese government officials outside our door waiting to be introduced to Australian food safety providers. But it's a message that we will keep, like water on a rock, we'll keep repeating it to the Chinese authorities, keep assuring them that we have the capacity to help, and hopefully, sooner or later, the Chinese will embrace the fact that others other than China can help address their problems. Okay, party political message. Minister Emerson, last year in Bali, November of the previous year, met with his Chinese counterpart, Chen Deming, and they agreed to undertake a joint study into agriculture cooperation between our two countries. The end result of that joint study was a report published last year called Feeding the Future. The key message, if I can distill the key message of that report, it would be that we in Australia are encouraging the Chinese to see Australia as a partial solution to their food security challenges. We have marginal agricultural land in the northeast and the northwest of our country, and Minister Emerson's vision, for those who follow his articles every Saturday in the Australian, is to encourage more foreign investment into Australia in a way that helps us make those marginal farmlands more productive. So we're not encouraging 100% ownership, we're encouraging Chinese capital, foreign capital more generally, to come into the Australian market and help our agribusiness sector become more productive. So the great example of that to date has been the Shanghai-based company Zhongfu, which has taken a lease on phase 2 or stage 2 of the Ord River scheme in the Kimberley. To a lesser extent, the Shandong investment in Cubby Station is another reflection of how Chinese capital is helping or should help Australian agribusiness develop. Obviously there are political sensitivities there and perception issues, but in general the point is that we're trying to engage China's interest in a way that uses their capital to our advantage. I'll just talk to the second dot point there. I'll make no bones about it. Australian companies in China do not compete on price, in general terms. We do not compete on price. It's quality, it's safety, and it's branding and innovation. It's the clean and green image sounds like something we all say as we stand up here extolling the virtues of Australia, but it actually means something in the Asian context. Okay, that's the reason why they're buying Australian milk powder, because we, like New Zealand, are trusted suppliers of food products. If we damage that brand in any way, we pull the rug out from underneath our longer-term prospects in the China market. I'm going to finish on this slide because it really tells the story, I think. About a week before I jumped on the plane to come here, I called the buyer for a large high-end supermarket chain in Hong Kong. Sorry, not in Hong Kong, in Shanghai. And I asked him if he'd be prepared to just field a couple of very simple questions to give me a sense from the coalface as to how the buyers think in the context of Australian products. I asked him where he sources his international brands for that supermarket, because it has brands from all over the world. His answer was 60% they find themselves. They send people around the globe looking for brands and they place them on their shelves. 40% of the products, generally speaking, come from individual companies making approaches to them to pitch their product. Or organisations like Austrade, trade promotion organisations, pitch products on behalf of international companies. So 60% they find themselves, 40% they are open to conversations with individual companies or with people like Austrade. Well, it says it up there, grocery products. In general, he did not pretend that the strong dollar had had no impact on sales of Australian items. The impact has hit hard. That said, and counterintuitively perhaps, dairy and beef continue to go gangbusters in that supermarket. So they have gone beyond UHT milk, they've gone to extended shelf life milk. So that milk, Pura Milk brand, the same blue and white carton you see on the shelf all across Australia, comes into China with a shelf life of around 30 to 38 days. By the time it clears customs, the shop still has 21 days to shift that product off their shelf. And it's moving. So I think there's a reference there to 110 cases every 2 to 3 weeks. Now, let me put a caveat on that. This supermarket is high-end. It is not typical of supermarkets in the second and third tier cities, so I don't want to pretend that this is a story writ large across China. However, I then went on to ask him about who's buying the Australian beef, who's buying the milk, who's buying the grocery items, because I thought, well, maybe it's just people like me. This is not a longer-term growth prospect for the China market. And his answer was very encouraging. 70% of those items are being bought by locals. Admittedly, high-wealth individuals, reasonably wealthy individuals. But it's not, that demand for beef, dairy and other products is not limited to 30% to wealthy expats living in that part of Shanghai. So that's a positive story. The final question I asked him is, what advice would you give to Australian companies about their general approach to the market, or to his supermarket in particular? The only comment he made was, don't touch the quality, don't touch the branding, because that's what helps those products move off the shelves. What he did say is that Australian companies generally need to be more flexible and give some thought to packaging. He said too many Australian products cater for the Australian desire for family packs, so 2 and 3 litre cartons of milk, 2 and 3 litre cartons of orange juice. And he cited berry juice as an example. He said if berry juice could just take their 1 litre UHT carton and bring it down to 500 mils, he reckons he could sell more of it because the price point becomes lower and more accessible to his market. So, just general thoughts to take away. It may not apply to everybody, but I thought it was an interesting observation that he made. Opportunities. Just very briefly, I'm not going to talk through these in detail. Approach to our office in Kunming in Yunnan province, local buyer wanting to buy 1,500 pregnant heifer cattle, pregnant heifers. The deal was done. Is Stuart Routledge here? Stuart? He was on the list, he didn't turn up. Okay. And then cotton seeds. We're putting these up to demonstrate Austrade's placing particular emphasis or particular pressure on our staff to engage with Chinese buyers and ask them, what do you want? What do you want to buy? What do you want to source? And our job is to find out they want the cattle, want the cotton seed, and then communicate that back to Australia. That's a great thing, and when it happens, it's terrific, and we should celebrate it. But let's not underestimate what you've also been told about the importance of relationships and investing time in cultivating a relationship with a potential buyer. It is rarely so simple as receiving a phone call from Austrade and being asked to name your price. Great when it happens, but it won't happen every day. Ladies and gentlemen, there endeth the lesson. I'll take questions later in the panel session. Thank you.